this video, we're going to be looking at finding trig values using these trig identities. So for number one, it says, given that sine of theta is equal to 4 over 5, and pi over 2 is less than theta, which is less than pi, find the values of the other 5 trig functions of theta. Okay, so a couple things to notice here. I'm given my sine of theta. I need to find the rest of them. First off, I could go ahead and quickly find cosecant of theta, because I know cosecant is just sine flipped. And so that means that cosecant of theta is 5 over 4. But now I need to figure out these other values. Well, if I go to my identities up here, I'm given sine. I want to figure out what these other ones are. One that we can use is the Pythagorean identity. That sine squared of theta plus cosine squared of theta is equal to 1. Because if I plug in my sine of theta in there, I can solve this to find what cosine of theta is equal to. Well, I have sine of theta is equal to 4/5, so this becomes that 4/5 squared plus cosine squared of theta is equal to 1. When I square that, I get 16 over 25. And then I'm going to subtract 16 over 25 from both sides. Well, when I do 1 minus 16 over 25, 1 is the same thing as 25 over 25. So 25 minus 16, I get 9 over 25. And then my last step, I need to go ahead and take the square root. And so when I take the square root, I get plus or minus 3/5. Because remember, when we're taking the square root of a fraction, I can really write this as the square root of 9 over the square root of 25, which gets me 3 over 5. Well, now I need to figure out whether this is going to be positive or if it's going to be negative. And so I need to see what quadrant it's in. And I see that my angle theta here is between pi over 2 and pi. And I know that that is in quadrant 2. And so I have down on the last page, all the way down over here, from our last lesson, sines of function values depending on what quadrant it's in. And I see that for cosine in quadrant 2, it is negative. And so that means up here that cosine of theta is going to equal to negative 3/5. So I have cosine. Now I can immediately find secant, because I know that secant is just going to be cosine flipped. And so that means that this is going to be negative 5 over 3. But now I need to figure out tangent of theta and cotangent of theta. Well, if I go back up to my identities, I see that tangent of theta is equal to sine of theta over cosine of theta. Well, sine of theta I have is 4/5. Cosine of theta is negative 3/5. So I'm dividing by fraction. So when I'm dividing by fraction, I can flip and change the division to multiplication. So I have 4/5 times 5 over negative 3. And so I get 4 over negative 3, since those 5s cancel out. And then cotangent is just going to be tangent flipped. So this is going to be negative 3 over 4. Okay, let's look at another one. So for this next one, we're given that cosine of theta is equal to 1 over 6, and 0 is less than theta, which is less than pi over 2. Find the values of the other 5 trigonometric functions of theta. So I want to again use my Pythagorean identity here, and so that tells me that sine squared of theta plus cosine squared of theta is equal to 1. I know cosine theta is 1 over 6, so I have sine squared of theta plus 1 over 6 squared is equal to 1. 1 over 36. And then when I subtract 1 over 36 from both sides, I get that sine squared of theta is equal to 36 over 6 minus 1 over 36. It's going to be 35 over 36. And then to get sine by itself, I just need to take the square root on both sides. And so I get that sine of theta is equal to plus or minus the square root of 35 over the square root of 36. Well, square root of 36 is just 6, and so this just becomes a 6 in the denominator. And now I need to figure out what sign I have there. And so looking back at my problem, it says that theta is between 0 and pi over 2. So that means that it's in quadrant 1. And so going down here, I see that for quadrant 1, sine of theta is positive. And so that means that sine of theta here is going to equal the square root of 35 over 6. So now we can go ahead and fill this out. So I found sine of theta. And so I know that cosecant is that flip, so it's going to be 6 over the square root of 35, which when I rationalize the denominator, it's really equal to 6 square root of 35 over 35. And then I know that secant of theta is going to be cosine flip. So it's going to be 6 over 1, or in other words, just 6. But now I need to find tangent of theta and cotangent of theta. So tangent of theta I know is sine of theta over cosine of theta. Well, sine of theta is square root of 35 over 6. And cosine of theta is 1 over 6. So that becomes square root of 35 over 6 times 6 over 1. And my 6's cancel out and end up with just the square root of 35. And then cotangent is tangent flipped. So instead of square root of 35 over 1, this is going to be 1 over the square root of 35, which when I rationalize that denominator, becomes square root of 35 over 35.